From New York, this is Democracy Now!
In times of crisis, seemingly impossible ideas suddenly become possible. But whose ideas? Sensible, fair ones, designed to keep as many people as possible safe, secure, and healthy? Or predatory ideas, designed to further enrich the already unimaginably wealthy while leaving the most vulnerable further exposed?
Naomi Klein, author of The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. Now she argues Trump's plan is a pandemic shock doctrine, but she says it's not the only way forward as the Senate passes a second coronavirus bailout and Trump pushes for a third.
6 weeks ago were the best they've ever been. We had the best economy we've ever had. And then one day you have to close it down in order to defeat this enemy. And but we're doing it, and we're doing it well.
We'll look at coronavirus capitalism and how to beat it with Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz. Then Trump doubles down on his use of the racist term Chinese virus.
Because it comes from China.
Racist.
It's not racist at all, no, not at all. It comes from China. That's why. It comes from China. I want to be accurate.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The death toll from the coronavirus pandemic sweeping the globe is nearing 9,000, with over 221,000 confirmed cases, as governments around the world increasingly shut down economies and lock down cities to slow the spread of the disease. In a positive sign, Hubei province in central China, where the virus first struck, for the first time reported no new local infections on Wednesday. In contrast, in Italy, there have been a record 475 deaths over the last day. In the city of Bergamo, soldiers were called in to transport away dozens of coffins as the city's crematorium failed to keep up with the pace of deaths. At least 91 people have died in Bergamo, and the city's hospital has run out of beds in its intensive care unit. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has ordered schools closed across the United Kingdom beginning Friday. Johnson reversed course this week after initially favoring a strategy to let the virus burn rapidly through the population in order to build herd immunity. He abandoned the approach after a study estimated without mitigation, 250,000 Britons would die. In Brazil, the president of the Senate has tested positive for COVID-19, along with 2 cabinet ministers and 19 members of President Bolsonaro's entourage on a recent trip to the U.S. to meet with President Trump. Over the weekend, Bolsonaro, who should have self-quarantined under guidelines suggested by his own government, joined packed political rallies, hugging supporters and posing for selfies. On Wednesday, Bolsonaro and government ministers put on face masks at a news conference announcing new emergency measures to contain the virus. All over Brazil, millions of homebound residents went onto their balconies Wednesday evening, banging pots and pans and shouting "Bolsonaro out" in protests against the far-right president's handling of the crisis. Reuters reports U.S. labs have run just 60,000 coronavirus tests since late January, when the first case was detected in the U.S., compared to South Korea, which has tested nearly 300,000 people in the same time period. In Geneva, the World Health Organization's top emergency official, Dr. Michael Ryan, said the failure of countries like the United States to screen for coronavirus is helping the disease to spread.
Every suspect case should be tested, their contacts identified. If those contacts are sick or showing symptoms, they should be tested. That requires a scale up because many countries have not been systematically testing all suspect cases, and it's one of the reasons why we're behind in this epidemic.
In Egypt, 4 women activists were arrested in Cairo Wednesday for protesting medical neglect in Egyptian prisons and demanding the immediate release of prisoners at risk of coronavirus. Egyptian authorities have since announced the women, including the world-renowned writer Adef Souef, will be released on bail. In Yemen, where a U.S.-supported Saudi-led war has killed over 100,000 people and shattered the healthcare infrastructure, medical workers are bracing for the rapid spread of coronavirus. Already 80% of Yemenis rely on humanitarian assistance, with high rates of malnutrition, malaria, and cholera. One textile factory manager in Sana'a switched from producing clothing to makeshift masks for the coming pandemic.
We are driven by need. Coronavirus is knocking on the whole world's door. Yemen is a country under siege and under attack, and its institutions and factories are working at the lowest capacity, as you can see in this factory.
In Iran, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei will pardon 10,000 additional prisoners, including political prisoners, as the official death toll from coronavirus topped 1,100, though the World Health Organization believes the true number is 5 times higher. Iran's prisoner release came as Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said the Trump administration's imposing new sanctions on Iran to, quote, deprive the regime of critical income from its petrochemical industry and further Iran's economic and diplomatic isolation, unquote. Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders tweeted in response, U.S. sanctions should not be contributing to this humanitarian disaster. As a caring nation, we must lift any sanctions hurting Iran's ability to address this crisis, including financial sanctions, Sanders said. President Trump Wednesday signed a coronavirus relief package providing unemployment benefits and free coronavirus testing to millions of Americans suddenly out of a job. The aid package guarantees paid sick leave to less than 20% of American workers. It does not apply to companies with 500 or more workers, and workplaces with fewer than 50 workers can request to opt out. On Wednesday, the White House also ordered the suspension of evictions and foreclosures through April. On Wall Street, the Dow Jones plummeted 7% at midday, triggering an automatic halt to trading for the 4th time in the last 2 weeks. The market crash has wiped out nearly all stock market gains since President Trump took office in early 2017. On Wednesday, all big 3 U.S. auto companies, Ford, General Motors, and Fiat Chrysler, decided to halt production for at least 2 weeks under pressure by the United Auto Workers Union to close plants for safety reasons. The closures came after a worker at a Ford plant in Dearborn, Michigan, tested positive for COVID-19. About 150,000 factory workers will be idled. Under a union agreement, many will receive supplemental pay along with state unemployment benefits. Meanwhile, Hyundai halted production at its plant in Montgomery, Alabama, after a worker tested positive. President Trump has invoked the Korean War-era Defense Production Act to allow the government to direct industrial production. The White House's top economic advisor, Larry Kudlow, said Wednesday he's consulting with General Motors CEO to use idled factories to produce ventilators, which will be critical to keeping patients alive when a surge of coronavirus cases reaches hospitals. Kudlow also said the Trump administration is considering taking an equity stake in companies bailed out by taxpayers. In 2008, Kudlow blasted a similar move by the Obama administration to take a stake in General Motors after a bailout as, quote, an attack on free market capitalism. Billionaire hedge fund investor Bill Ackman called Wednesday on President Trump to shut down the country for the next 30 days and close the borders. Ackman tweeted, quote, with exponential compounding, every day we postpone the shutdown costs thousands and soon hundreds of thousands and then millions of lives and destroys the economy. Ackman was speaking from self-isolation. On Capitol Hill, 2 House lawmakers said Thursday they've tested positive for COVID-19. Republican Congressmember Mario Diaz-Balart of Florida and Democrat Ben McAdams of Utah. Diaz-Balart tweeted he's feeling much better after coming down with a fever and headache Saturday. He wrote, it's important that everyone take this seriously and follow CDC guidelines in order to avoid getting sick and mitigate the spread of this virus, unquote. Republican House Minority Whip Steve Scalise said he would self-quarantine for the next 2 weeks after close contact with Diaz-Balart. A Pew Research Center poll found more than 3 in 4 Republicans believe the media has exaggerated the threat of the virus, following the lead of President Trump, who's repeatedly said the virus will go away, while accusing Democrats of making the coronavirus their new hoax. Dr. Deborah Birx of the White House Coronavirus Task Force said Wednesday millennials may be at higher risk of getting seriously ill or dying from coronavirus than previously thought. Despite that, Florida Republican Governor Ron DeSantis rejected calls Wednesday to close beaches and instead ordered beachgoers to limit themselves to parties of 10 or fewer. The pandemic is increasingly threatening prisoners and migrants held behind bars in immigration jails. An officer at New York's infamous Rikers Island jail tested positive for COVID-19. Prisoners at the Yakima County Department of Corrections in Washington state have been quarantined after developing respiratory problems. Meanwhile, hospitals around the United States are already reporting shortages of testing swabs and protective gear to shield medical workers from injection. In Washington state, workers at Providence St. Joseph Health purchased vinyl sheets, foam, and industrial tape from Home Depot and began manufacturing their own face shields and masks after supplies began to dwindle. President Trump said he's immediately deploying 2 Navy hospital ships to free up capacity in civilian hospitals, but the Pentagon acknowledged Wednesday that the Comfort and the Mercy will take weeks to deploy. They're currently under repair. Amidst a severe shortage of test kits in the U.S., there are growing concerns that ordinary people who fall ill are less likely to be tested than the rich and the powerful. On Wednesday, the Brooklyn Nets said it hired a private lab to test its entire team after a game with the Golden State Warriors last week. 4 Nets players, including superstar Kevin Durant, tested positive. In a tweet, New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio wished them a speedy recovery, but added, with all due respect, an entire NBA team should not get tested for COVID-19 while there are critically ill patients waiting to be tested. Tests should not be for the wealthy, but for the sick, the New York mayor said. President Trump opened a White House press briefing on the pandemic Wednesday with a statement that took on racist and xenophobic overtones.
I would like to begin by announcing some important developments in our war against the Chinese virus.
Conference, Trump was questioned by reporter Cecilia Vega.
Why do you keep calling this the Chinese virus? There are reports of dozens of incidents of bias against Chinese Americans in this country. Your own aide, Secretary Azar, says he does not use this term. He says ethnicity does not cause the virus. Why do you keep using this? A lot of people say it's racist.
It's not racist at all. No, not at all. It comes from China. That's why. It comes from China.
This came a day after CBS White House correspondent Wei Jiang, who describes herself in her Twitter profile as a Chinese-born West Virginian, tweeted, quote, "This morning, a White House official referred to coronavirus as the Kung flu to my face. Makes me wonder what they're calling it behind my back," she said. We'll have more on racist remarks by President Trump and Republican lawmakers later in the broadcast. In China, satellite data show tough measures enacted to halt the spread of the coronavirus have dramatically cut emissions of toxic nitrogen dioxide. A Stanford University researcher estimated the huge reduction in air pollution as parts of China's economy ground to a halt may have prevented the premature deaths of tens of thousands of people. In Venice, Italy, dolphins and fish have been spotted in the city's famous canals as they turned from muddy brown to crystal clear water amidst a drop-off in boat traffic. In immigration news, the U.S.-Canada border has been temporarily closed to non-essential traffic as an attempt to deter the spread of the coronavirus. Trade will not be affected. It's unknown how long the border closure will last. Meanwhile, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, says it will temporarily postpone arresting immigrants during the pandemic and will allegedly instead focus on apprehending people who pose public safety risks and who are subject to mandatory detention on criminal grounds. This comes as ICE agents continued to make arrests across the country this week, including in Colorado and California, where much of the state is in lockdown. In Georgia, immigrant rights groups have revealed that the state's Department of Driver Services has been sharing information about state residents, including facial recognition searches with immigration officials. Documents obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request found between September 2017 and last June, the department processed over 250 requests from Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, and other agencies, quote, to gather and share information on hundreds of immigrants living in Georgia. And Senator Bernie Sanders has shot down rumors he's planning to suspend his campaign after losses in Tuesday's primaries in Florida, Illinois, and Arizona. With about 2,000 delegates needed to clinch the Democratic presidential nomination, Joe Biden has claimed 1,180 delegates to Sanders' 885. Asked by a CNN correspondent Wednesday to give a timetable for his next steps, Senator Sanders responded, quote, "I'm dealing with a bleeping global crisis," he added. "I'm trying to do my best to make sure that we don't have an economic meltdown and that people don't die," he said. Meanwhile, The Intercept reports elections officials in Chicago used nearly 50 housing facilities for low-income seniors as polling locations on Tuesday, despite warnings that crowds of voters posed a threat of transmitting the coronavirus to an already high-risk population. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Today, we spend much of the hour looking at the economic impact of the coronavirus pandemic, what some are calling coronavirus capitalism. Soon, we'll be joined by Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz, whose new book is People, Power, and Profits: Progressive Capitalism for an Age of Discontent. But first, we begin with a new video by author and activist Naomi Klein, produced by The Intercept. In 2007, Klein wrote The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. Now she argues Trump's plan is a pandemic shock doctrine, but it's not the only way forward. The video opens with this quote from economist Milton Friedman, who says, "Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around."
Ideas that are lying around. Friedman, one of history's most extreme free market economists, was wrong about a whole lot, but he was right about that. In times of crisis, seemingly impossible ideas suddenly become possible. But whose ideas? Sensible, fair ones, designed to keep as many people as possible safe, secure, and healthy? Or predatory ideas, designed to further enrich the already unimaginably wealthy while leaving the most vulnerable further exposed? The world economy is seizing up in the face of cascading shocks.
COVID-19 can be characterized as a pandemic.
In the wake of the coronavirus crisis, stocks have stopped trading on Wall Street after a 7% drop.
This is a historical day, the biggest drop we've seen since that crash in 1987.
The drop was spurred by a growing oil price war as the market was already weakened by coronavirus fears.
Yeah, no, I don't take responsibility at all.
In the midst of this widespread panic, corporate lobbyists of all stripes are, of course, dusting off all the ideas they had lying around. Trump is pushing a suspension of the payroll tax, which could bankrupt Social Security, providing the excuse to cut it or privatize it completely. An idea that has been lying around for a very long time.
A worker at his or her option ought to be allowed to put some of their own money in a private savings account.
Lying around on both sides of the aisle.
When I argued that we should freeze federal spending, I meant Social Security as well. I meant Medicare and Medicaid.
And then there are the ideas being floated to bail out some of the wealthiest and most polluting sectors in our economy.
We are working very closely with the cruise line industry, likewise with the airline industry. They're two great industries, and we'll be helping them through this patch.
Bailouts for fracking companies, not to mention cruise ships, airlines, and hotels, handouts which Trump could benefit from personally. Which is a big problem because the virus isn't the only crisis we face. There's also climate disruption, and these industries that are getting rescued with our money are the ones driving it. Trump has also been meeting with the private health insurers.
We're meeting with the top executives of the health insurance companies.
The very ones who have made sure that so many Americans can't afford the care they need. And what are the chances they don't have their hands out? It seems like the whole pandemic is getting outsourced.
Well, Mr. President, thank you for inviting us here today, along with our colleagues from Walmart and Walgreens and our partners at CVS. Normally, you'd view us as competitors, but today we're focused on a common competitor, and that's defeating the spread of the coronavirus.
The Fed's first move was to pump $1.5 trillion into the financial markets, with more undoubtedly on the way. But if you're a worker, especially a gig worker, there's a very good chance you're out of luck. If you do need to see a doctor for care, there's a good chance no one's going to help you pay if you aren't covered. And if you want to heed the public health warnings to stay home from work, there's also a chance that you won't get paid. Of course, you still need to pay your rent and all of your debts, medical, student credit card, mortgage. The results are predictable. Too many sick people have no choice but to go to work, which means more people contracting and spreading the virus. And without comprehensive bailouts for workers, we can expect more bankruptcies and more homelessness down the road. Look, we know this script. In 2008, the last time we had a global financial meltdown, the same kinds of bad ideas for no-strings-attached corporate bailouts carried the day. And regular people around the world paid the price. And even that was entirely predictable. 13 years ago, I wrote a book called The Shock Doctrine: The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. It described a brutal and recurring tactic by right-wing governments. After a shocking event, a war, coup, terrorist attack, market crash, or natural disaster, they exploit the public's disorientation, suspend democracy, push through radical free market policies that enrich the 1% at the expense of the poor and middle class. But here is what my research has taught me. Shocks and crises don't always go the shock doctrine path. In fact, it's possible for crisis to catalyze a kind of evolutionary leap. Think of the 1930s, when the Great Depression led to the New Deal.
The only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
In the United States and elsewhere, governments began to weave a social safety net so that the next time there was a crash, there would be programs like Social Security to catch people.
The right of every family to a decent home, the right to adequate medical care, and the opportunity to achieve and enjoy good health.
Look, we know what Trump's plan is. A pandemic shock doctrine featuring all the most dangerous ideas lying around. From privatizing Social Security, to locking down borders, to caging even more migrants. Hell, he might even try canceling elections. But the end of this story hasn't been written yet. It is an election year, and social movements and insurgent politicians are already mobilized. And like in the 1930s, we have a whole bunch of other ideas lying around.
Do we believe that everybody should be entitled as a right to health care?
Yeah. We will not stop organizing and fighting until all unhoused folks who want shelter have shelter. Canceling student debt.
It makes so much sense that if you're sick, that you should not be penalized where you don't have an income.
Many of these ideas were dismissed as too radical just a week ago. Now, they're starting to seem like the only reasonable path to get out of this crisis and prevent future ones.
Now, here's something that helps explain the difference between the testing situation in South Korea and the U.S. The South Korea, like European countries and Canada, has universal single-payer insurance, and that means that it's easier to mobilize, and also people know what to do. There is pretty much one answer for how to get testing. The U.S. is a patchwork of countless different systems, and so you can't say, here's exactly the steps that every American should take in order to get tested.
And with Washington suddenly in the giant stimulus business, this is precisely the time for the stimulus that many of us have been talking about for years.
Today is the day that we truly embark on a comprehensive agenda of economic, social, and racial justice in the United States of America.
It's called the Green New Deal. Instead of rescuing the dirty industries of the last century, we should be boosting the clean ones that will lead us into safety in the coming century. If there is one thing history teaches us, it's that moments of shock are profoundly volatile. We either lose a whole lot of ground, get fleeced by elites, and pay the price for decades, or we win progressive victories that seemed impossible just a few weeks earlier. This is no time to lose our nerve. The future will be determined by whoever is willing to fight harder for the ideas they have lying around.
That's author and activist Naomi Klein of The Intercept. The video ends with Milton Friedman's quote, "Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When the crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on ideas that are laying around. That, I believe, is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes politically inevitable." This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. When we come back, Nobel Prize-winning economist Joe Stiglitz. Stay with us. Alberto Hestoso, performing the Titanic theme song, My Heart Will Go On, for his quarantine neighbors in Barcelona. He was on his balcony. Spain has had more than 3,400 cases of the coronavirus in the last 24 hours. Now at least 17,000 people are infected, and that's only what is known without widespread testing. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Trump Wednesday signed a coronavirus relief package providing unemployment benefits and free coronavirus testing to millions of Americans suddenly out of a job. The aid package guarantees paid leave to less than 20% of American workers. It does not apply to companies with 500 or more workers, and workplaces with fewer than 50 workers can request to opt out. On Wednesday, the White House also ordered the suspension of evictions and foreclosures through April. On Wall Street, the Dow Jones plummeted 7% at midday, triggering an automatic halt to trading for the fourth time in the last 2 weeks. The market crash has wiped out nearly all stock market gains since President Trump took office in 2017. Earlier this month, Trump signed into law an $8 billion coronavirus response package. At a White House press conference Wednesday, Trump laid out the first details of a third $1 trillion economic package and invoked the Korean War-era Defense Production Act to allow the government to direct industrial production.
in a sense, a wartime president. I mean, that's what we're fighting. You have to close parts of an economy that 6 weeks ago were the best they've ever been. We had the best economy we've ever had. And then one day you have to close it down in order to defeat this enemy. We'll be invoking the Defense Production Act just in case we need it. In other words, I think you all know what it is, and it can do a lot of good things if we need it, and we will have it all completed.
The person in charge of the bailouts are Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin, formerly of Goldman Sachs. He ran One West Bank after the 2008 financial crisis and oversaw so many foreclosures. He was called the foreclosure king. Well, for more on these bailouts and who benefits, for more on the legislation that has been passing, and for what's happening in the world today in this pandemic, we're joined by Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel Prize-winning economist, Columbia University professor, chief economist for the Roosevelt Institute, served as chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Bill Clinton, and as chief economist of the World Bank. His latest book, just coming out, hopefully, depending on what this world looks like, is People, Power, and Profits: Progressive Capitalism for an Age of Discontent. We thank you so much for joining us, Joe, and I just want to let our viewers and listeners know you're joining us from your home because here in New York and all over the country, we're being told that it is safest for people to isolate. Before you talk about the bailout, just talk about your thoughts right now and what's happening in this city, New York, and the world.
Well, this is a time of crisis. In the 2008 crisis, Rahm Emanuel, who was the chief of staff of Obama, said you shouldn't let a crisis go to waste. But they did let that crisis go to waste. We needed to reform our financial system. We need to reform our economy. And we didn't. The money went to the big banks, and we didn't get the money to the people who really needed it. So the question is, as your excellent clip from Naomi Klein said, what will we do with this crisis? Will this reinforce the ugly tendencies we've had for growing inequality, for corporate welfare, or will it actually succeed in reforming our economy? You know, it's remarkable. Just a little while ago, people said we couldn't afford this program helping college students with immense debt, or we couldn't afford providing health care for everyone. And all of a sudden, the president is talking about a $1 trillion, $2 trillion bailout. We always could have afforded these things. It was just our prioritization was wrong.
I wanted to go to the Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, describing the administration's proposed economic relief package.
We've put a proposal on the table that would inject $1 trillion into the economy. That is on top of the $300 billion from the IRS deferrals. Now, let me just say, this is a combination of loans. This is a combination of direct checks to individuals. This is a combination of creating liquidity for small businesses. I think Congress right now should be concerned about the American workers and small business. You know, interest rates are incredibly low, so there's very little cost of borrowing this money. And as I've said in different times, we'll fix the deficit. This is not the time to worry about it.
So that's Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, formerly called the foreclosure king. Talk about what he is laying out right now.
Well, the one part that is good is sending checks to everyone. I think the amounts that they're talking about are inadequate, and it's not just a one-time thing. If, as many epidemiologists say, this is going to last for several months, there'll have to be second and third and fourth tranches of those checks. If we don't do that, people whose income has collapsed, people who are left unemployed, remember we have the worst unemployment system of any of the advanced countries, all these people who are not going to be able to pay their bills and will have a cascade of problems. While it's a good thing that the Trump administration has ordered federal agencies to stop evictions and foreclosures, it doesn't apply to the private sector banks. And their evictions and foreclosures may well go on, and that's where most of the evictions and foreclosures will occur. So we need to get that money into the system, and we need to get the money to ordinary individuals. So that part, I think, is good. It needs to be taxed at the rate that individuals normally pay, so that in a year from now, 2 years when we return to normal, those at the top who've gotten money and didn't need it, that money will go back to the Treasury. So this ought to be treated as ordinary income, and a significant part of that money that was going to the top should be recuperated. But the other part is really not the way we ought to be going. The part of giving money to the airlines, so the cruise ships. The airlines had a huge bonanza from the tax bill of 2017, and rather than use that money to build up buffers in times of emergency, they had billions and billions of share buybacks. So if we give them money, we have to make sure that they satisfy certain conditions corresponding to the environment, to governance, to labor, and we need warrants. That's a way of making sure that the American taxpayer is protected against the risk. And then there are a whole set of things that the bailout, the package doesn't address. Our state and localities are going to be facing a very difficult time. Their revenues are plummeting. They don't have the luxury of running deficits. Most of them have what are called balanced budget frameworks. So if the revenues go down, there's going to be a cutback in education and health, in the basic ingredients of making that we ordinary people need so much. So a higher priority than bailing out the cruise ship companies is helping the states and localities. So we need a massive revenue sharing program between the states and localities.
So, one of the voices that we don't hear, or the voices overall that we don't hear at the White House, as we see this stream of CEOs surrounding Trump, or the conversations he's having in the last few weeks, are the people, the workers directly affected. I wanted to bring in Sarah Nelson, a clip of the president of the Association of Flight Attendants Union.
We have told Congress that any stimulus funds for the aviation industry must come with strict rules. That includes requiring employers across aviation to maintain pay and benefits for every worker. No taxpayer money for CEO bonuses, stock buybacks, or dividends. No breaking contracts through bankruptcy. And no federal funds for airlines that are fighting their workers' efforts to join a union.
So that's Sarah Nelson, head of the Flight Attendants Union. Joe Stiglitz, if you can talk about what is actually happening here and what would a bottom-up bailout actually look like? What would it mean if the workers were guaranteed everything from the paid leave? It's keeps on being repeated. Now workers will have paid medical leave, but we hear that it's well less than 20%, and that was reduced over the weekend through negotiations with Mnuchin.
So first, let me say the Trump proposal is another instance of trickle-down economics. Give money to the corporations, and maybe it'll trickle down to ordinary citizens. And we know from the past it's not going to happen. The 2017 tax bill did not lead to more investment, did not lead to significantly higher wages. It led to bigger almost $1 trillion of share buybacks. And so, as you say, what we need is a bottoms-up approach. And what she was pointing out is that if you give money to these industries, they aren't going to necessarily behave well. And you see that so clearly in the fight that the big companies fought against paid sick leave. And let me say why that's really important. It's not just helping the workers, it's helping all of us. Because if they don't get sick leave, they're going to go to work. And if they go to work, it will help transmit the disease. So we need a system that people can say, if I'm sick, I don't need to go to work. And the decision of the Trump administration to fight having universal sick leave is another example of their contributing to the spread of the virus and making the pandemic all the worse.
Joe Stiglitz, can you talk about what this looks like globally and what is happening with this pandemic, laying bare the growing wealth inequality in the world?
Well, what we've created over the last 50 years is a highly globally integrated economy. There are some other aspects of this economy that we've created. We created an economy without resilience. I illustrate that by the cars today that don't have spare tires. You save a little money not having a spare tire. The fact is that when you get the flat tire, you realize what a mistake that was. Not having a spare tire makes it short run, it looks like you've saved a little money. In the long run, you really suffer. And we've created a whole economic system that is extraordinarily fragile, just-in-time inventory production with no inventories. And as we've created this system where you try to squeeze every ounce out of the of waste out of the system, you've also squeezed ordinary workers. And that is what's contributed to this growing inequality. And those two are the same, different sides of the same coin. So our growing inequality and our increased fragility are issues that hopefully the lessons that we'll learn from this crisis is we need to construct a different kind of capitalism, a different kind of economy that I call in my book progressive capitalism, but it recognizes that the market doesn't work very well in addressing the major problems our society faces: resilience, inequality, climate change, you name it. They haven't done a good job on it.
I wanted to go back to what's happening here. You have Whole Foods CEO John Mackey under fire after he sent out an email to employees saying workers could donate accumulated paid time off to fellow workers with medical emergencies or a death in the family during the pandemic. Your thoughts, Joe Stiglitz?
Well, this is an example of encouraging charity from others. Why don't these people at the very top say, well, at this moment of crisis where we're all in it together, I'm going to cut off my multi-million-dollar pay. I'm going to go make a major sacrifice, and I'm going to give everybody paid sick leave, paid family leave. I'm going to show that from the top down. And of course, I hope that you will be equally generous, but it should start from the top. And that's what's so bad about both the administration and the example that you just gave. Leadership should start from the top by example. And obviously, we're not getting that in this country.
Can you talk about how it works when they say people will get unemployment? The reports of people trying to apply online, the server is crashing repeatedly because so many people are out of work, and how $1,000 checks will be sent out, how you ensure if there is a law that says your employer has to give you paid medical leave, how you enforce this.
Well, I mean, you've put your finger on a major problem that has not gotten sufficient attention. Because of the devastation of our administration, of our government that has occurred in recent years, they disbanded the White House pandemic task force. They defunded the Center for Disease Control, which is the basis of giving us information and developing our response to a crisis like this. We are less able to respond. And that means it's almost a fantasy to believe that we can get checks out in 2 weeks. That's why some of the other things I talked about are so important. We have to make it absolutely clear that nobody's going to be evicted. There's going to be no foreclosure, not only on the part of the government, but on the part of the banks, the landlords. People can't have their utilities cut off because those checks won't be there, and there's a lot of Americans living on the edge. Data I talk about in my book about the fraction of the population, a very large fraction of the population, that has reserves of less than $500 or $1,000. They're living from paycheck to paycheck. And right now, there are no paychecks. So this inability to respond is going to be a major problem. And then the other point that you made is gotten a lot of attention more recently, that even companies that have said that they have sick leave policy, when employees ask for the sick leave, they get punished. And so we have to set up administrative mechanisms that say we will hold the companies that don't grant their workers these benefits, we're going to hold them accountable. And of course, with the president saying, I'm not responsible, you might ask, what does that mean? But what that means is that there needs to be significant fines on any company that deprives any worker of his basic rights, including the right to sick leave.
So this whole issue that Naomi Klein raises of disaster capitalism, of in this moment of upheaval, that it depends who moves forward fastest and most strategically in moving forward with their ideas. Your thoughts as we move forward in this election year, unclear even if this election would be held in November. Trump amassing the kind of powers that he is. And even still, I'm wondering if you could comment on his position right now. On the one hand, supporting giving $1,000 to each American, and I'm not exactly sure what that means, who gets it and who doesn't. And you combine that with his ultra-nationalist politics, kids in cages, the wall, the racist Chinese virus language that he uses. Can you comment on this kind of economic populism?
Well, I think the point that this crisis makes clear is that we're all in it together. The virus doesn't discriminate, just like the virus doesn't have a nationality. The virus doesn't discriminate on the basis of nationality, of race, of religion. And so we're all in this together. So this is a moment, it should be a moment of national unity. And as Naomi pointed out, there are two directions we can go. We could either exacerbate the divisions, or we can say there's another direction. One of the reasons I wrote my book, People, Power, and Profits on Progressive Capitalism, was to lay out that alternative agenda, to make it clear that there are a lot of ideas about how to transform our society into the kind of society that deals with the problems that we're facing, the problem of inequality, climate change, the moral turpitude that we've seen so pervasive in the financial sector, and Dieselgate, and the drug companies, and the food companies. There is an alternative. And so I actually think we have the ideas with which to respond. And they've been articulated in the primary contest, many of these critical ideas. So my hope is that as Americans realize how badly things have gone how the kind that this crisis, we didn't turn to the private sector to solve it. We turned to the government. We realized that we have to do this collectively. If we're all on our own, it won't work. The private sector did not provide the masks, did not provide the test on its own, and a failed government. And the Trump administration is a failed government, didn't work. But there is a different kind of government that can work. And we've seen that in a number of countries where things are going much better. So we can see that if we pull together, there is an alternative, and one which will protect us against this disease, but also can create a society with greater shared prosperity and address the climate crisis.
Well, Joe Stiglitz, I'm going to ask you to stay after the hour so that we can have an extended conversation. I want to ask you about how your progressive capitalism compares to Bernie Sanders' democratic socialism and more. But right now we have to break. Joe Stiglitz, Nobel Prize-winning economist, Columbia University professor, chief economist for the Roosevelt Institute. He served as chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Bill Clinton, and chief economist of the World Bank. His latest book, People, Power, and Profits, Progressive Capitalism for an Age of Discontent. When we come back, Trump doubles down on his use of the racist term Chinese virus. Stay with us.
Dear Dr. Bonnie, what to say to you? You have nice eyes, and we just learned your name. When you came into our world, you cried, and it broke our hearts. We dedicate noon every day to you. Sometimes it's 3, and other times early. When Trudeau's late, then we have to wait, and it isn't great.
Dear Dr. Bonnie, an ode to Canada's provincial health officer, Dr. Bonnie Henry in British Columbia, who has been giving daily updates on the spread of COVID-19. The song is sung by 2 members of her new fan club. You may recognize the music. It's from the song Dear Theodosia in the Broadway show Hamilton. All of Broadway is shut down right now, and the Prime Minister of Canada is in self-isolation because his wife has tested positive for COVID-19. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman.
Begin by announcing some important developments in our war against the Chinese virus. We'll be invoking the Defense Production Act just in case we need it.
That was the opening line of President Trump's news conference about coronavirus on Wednesday. Later in the conference, he was questioned by ABC News reporter Cecilia Vega.
Why do you keep calling this the Chinese virus? There are reports of dozens of incidents of bias against Chinese Americans in this country. Your own aide, Secretary Azar, says he does not use this term. He says ethnicity does not cause the virus. Why do you keep using this? A lot of people say it's racist.
It's not racist at all. No, not at all. It comes from China. That's why. Comes from China. I want to be accurate.
About Chinese Americans
please,
in
John.
This country.
Please.
The aides behind you. Are you comfortable with this term?
I have great love for all of the people from our country, but as you know, China tried to say at one point, maybe they stopped now, that it was caused by American soldiers. That can't happen. It's not going to happen. Not as long as I'm president. It comes from China.
It comes from China, he said. PBS correspondent Yamiche Alcindor also questioned Trump at his news conference.
There are some, at least one White House official, who used the term Kung Flu, referring to the fact that this virus started in China. Is that acceptable? Is it wrong? Are you worried that having this virus be talked about as a Chinese virus, that might...
I wonder who said that. You know who said that?
I'm not sure the person's name, but would you condemn the fact...
Say the term again.
A person at the White House used the term Kung Flu. My question is, do you think that's wrong, Kung Flu? And do you think using the term Chinese virus, that puts Asian Americans at risk, that people might target them?
No, not at all. I think they probably would agree with it 100%. It comes from China.
Yamiche Alcindor was referring to an incident reported by CBS White House correspondent Weijia Jiang, who describes herself in her Twitter profile as a Chinese-born West Virginian. She tweeted on Tuesday, "This morning a White House official referred to coronavirus as the Kung flu to my face. Makes me wonder what they're calling it behind my back," she said. Well, for more, we're joined by Elizabeth Ouyang, the former president of OCA New York, a civil rights group where she advocated for victims of hate crimes and fair media representation of Asian Americans, civil rights attorney, community advocate who teaches at Columbia and New York University. Liz, thanks so much for joining us. Can you respond to President Trump repeatedly saying this, calling the coronavirus the Chinese virus?
Certainly. There's a big difference in saying that the virus originated in China versus calling it a Chinese virus. By calling it a Chinese virus, it is implying for people who have limited interaction with persons of Asian descent and information about how this virus is spread, that it's people who are Chinese or they think are Chinese who have this virus. And this leads to a domino effect of both economic ostracization as well as social ostracization that leads to people not going to Chinese business establishments because they're afraid that they have the virus, or on the other extreme, it leads to hate crimes that we've seen, from California to New York, whether it be cars being vandalized and racist graffiti scrawled all over the cars, or actual physical assaults of women and men of Asian descent who people think may have the virus because they are Asian, and they're attacked, kicked, sprayed with things on the subway.
And then you have Republican Senator John Cornyn of Texas, quick to defend President Trump's use of the term Chinese virus.
Well, I think China is to blame because the culture where people eat bats and snakes and dogs and things like that, these viruses are transmitted from the animal to the people, and that's why China has been the source of a lot of these viruses like SARS, like MERS, the swine flu.
Critics say Senator Cornyn wasn't just being openly racist. He's also bad at geography. MERS stands for Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, which was first reported in Saudi Arabia in 2012, and the swine flu originated in the United States in 2009 before spreading around the world, according to the CDC. So, Liz Ouyang, if you can talk further about what this means, especially as this pandemic rips through this country.
People need to understand that pandemics and novel pathogens could come from barns of a state fair or the, turf of a college football field. And so when so-called leaders defend this these irresponsible statements, it further fuels divisiveness and misguided information and takes us away from where we need to be focused, and that is helping people most vulnerable in getting the disease, elderly or people with respiratory illnesses, and making sure that they're protected. I've never been to Wuhan, and I am as frightened as my non-Asian neighbors, non-Asian American neighbors as well of the disease. And we need to unite together to fight it and not scapegoat a minority of color for this illness. As your previous speaker said, this pandemic goes beyond borders. It has no racial exclusivity to it. People of all races, unfortunately, are coming down with it. And if you think only people of Chinese descent have it or may have it, then you miss the white lawyer from Miami who flew to New York and was infected.
Well, we want to thank you so much, Elizabeth Ouyang, for joining us, former president of OCA New York, advocate for victims of hate crimes and fair media representation of Asian Americans. And that does it for our broadcast. I want to thank the incredibly dedicated team of Democracy Now!, most of whom are working from their homes in self-isolation. This is a very difficult time, but they are every day devoted to producing this stellar newscast, Democracy Now! Thank you to them all.